there was something on Raw that really got my attention, and for those of you who watched it, it wasn't the stuff with CM Punk, but actually the Evan Bourne and Kofi Kingston match with Michael McGillicuddy and that disgrace David Otunga. And it wasn't so much the quality of the match that got my attention, it was the presentation of it. And in the presentation of it, it looked like for one night tag team wrestling and the tag team championships actually meant something. And they got this great reaction after the match was done, and the fans really got into it. And then afterwards they invested in a segment where all the talent was standing there applauding them, clapping them, pouring champagne on them and all of that, and it actually looked like an important victory, and the tag team titles meant something for a change. And then later on in Raw, Santino Marella comes out and gets blasted by The Miz and R-Truth, and they just come out, and I was very impressed by the two of them. They came out and just really went to town on the local fans there, and really started to go back and forth on them and form this on-screen alliance. And it made me think right away that maybe the WWE are going to reinvest in tag team wrestling. It's wishful thinking, but I really hope that that's what they do. And it looks like it looks like the next logical step that Otunga, heaven forbid he ever does. It looks like Miz and R-Truth are going to be this alliance, and it looks like a logical step to have them in there with Evan Bourne and Kofi Kingston. Now, there have been rumours for a few weeks now with Triple H in charge. There's been some discussion about re-emphasising tag team wrestling and reinvesting in it, because I won't say in pro wrestling, but in the WWE certainly, tag team wrestling has been a dying art. Tag teams now exist either just to fill some space on a card, or just to promote a singles guy and get a singles guy ready for a big singles push. They don't really have any long-term planning in tag teams, and they don't really invest enough time in tag teams, and that's, history has shown over the last 4 to 5 years that that's been the case. Now, thinking about it, and if you go back to the successful periods that the WWE have had, whether it was in the 80s and the 90s, the late 80s and the 90s, or the Attitude Era, one of the things you'll notice, and this is just my opinion and you can feel free to correct me, I always noticed that the roster then was very, very well rounded. It wasn't just about emphasizing that one key main event guy, which is what the company have become obsessed about doing now. It wasn't about just having that one headline guy and loads of single stars. They had a very well-rounded, diverse roster filled with a cast of characters that were very entertaining and had their roles, and those roles were presented as important. And you'll notice in the 80s there was a bit of a golden era of tag team wrestling. You had teams like the Hart Foundation, you had teams like the British Bulldogs, you had teams like the Nasty Boys, you had teams like Blanchard and Anderson when they were in the company, the Orient Express, the Rockers, all these great teams, and they were stars and they added something to the roster. They weren't just filling space. They were filling space, but they were doing it in a meaningful way. And the company always invested in them and made them look important. And then when they started to de-emphasize tag teams in the mid-90s, there were a lot of problems, and maybe they found it harder to create stars. And then in the late 90s again, they started to have a boom. And yes, they did have Steve Austin at the forefront. And yes, they did have Mick Foley and D-Generation X and the Mike Tyson angle, which was a big part of it. But if you look further down in that roster and you look at some of the other things that were going on and some of the other stars that had been created, you'll notice that at least 6 stars, if you want to call them that, were tag teams. In the late 90s, you had a tag team like the New Age Outlaws, which was a very, very popular act, sold lots of merchandise and were stars in their own right without having to be singles wrestlers. And then things kept rolling. Then you had the Hardy Boys that came along, and they were this cool, young, exciting, energetic, fresh tag team that came into the forefront and really started to get some headway. You had Edge and Christian, who, people still want to see them involved together, and there's still money in having this some kind of interaction with the two of them, even though Edge is retired. But you had Edge and Christian back then, and then you had the Dudleys, and you had Too Cool and the APA. You had all these teams that they had their individual looks, they had their individual characters as teams, and they all kind of stood out, and they added something. And they weren't just dead air on screen, and they weren't just these unimportant things. The APA had their segments, the Edge and Christian had their segments, and they had the things that they did well. Then you had Team 3D or the Dudleys that were very over, and then you had the Hardys. And a lot of people call that like the tag team renaissance and a golden era for tag teams. And if you were actually look at that time period again, think about this. Steve Austin was injured for a lot of that. He was out for a lot of time during that era. Mick Foley retired in that era. The Rock was slowly starting to phase himself away from pro wrestling in that era. The Undertaker was injured for a lot of that time, but it didn't hurt the roster because, in fact, it forced the creative team to invest money, time, and writing and continuity into guys like Edge and Christian, the Dudleys, etc., etc. And it didn't hurt the roster when Austin, Taker, or Foley were gone, because you had other stars there, and people had more than one reason to watch. And then after about 2001, they de-emphasized it again. They had like a little mini reboot in 2002 with the Guerreros and Angle and Benoit, but that didn't last for very long. And then again in 2004, 2005, I want to say, it looked like SmackDown in particular was starting to reboot tag teams when you had Eminem and London and Kendrick and the Mexicals and Paul Burchill and William Regal, and then that kind of got de-emphasized again. And now, as time has gone by, any tag team that comes into the forefront is just used to fill some dead time, take some bumps for the main eventers, and then split up and then go their separate ways. And there's just no long-term planning in it, and I've always felt that was the biggest problem. That's why tag team wrestling has become a dying art. So now, with what we've seen on television, does anyone think that, fingers crossed, and this is a pipe dream, the WWE are going to start to get it and reinvest in tag teams and realize that they might find putting shows together a lot easier when they've got tag teams in there? I mean, you can say the same thing for women's division and the cruiserweight division, but in particular, tag teams. Would it be much easier to sell fans on the show when you've invested in tag team wrestling and tag team matches and made them important, and then you have more than one reason to watch? So it's not just about the John Cena match and the CM Punk match, but also, well, you've got that tag team ladder match or that tag team cage match that's happening, and that's really important. I must see that. Is that where we're going to go? Or is this just going to be one of these things where, the WWE, much like a lot of things, they build our hopes right up and we all think something's going to happen, and then a few weeks later, sorry, you guys are done. So let me know what you think. Write some comments. Let me know. What tag teams would you like to see in the WWE? It's rumored Generation Next are going to be coming to the WWE. Claudio Castagnoli and Chris Hero from Ring of Honor are another tag team that are almost signed with the company. Perhaps use some guys on your roster that are underutilized. That would be a tremendous way to use guys like that. I mean, Primo Colon could be aligned with Brodus Clay and have them as allies of Alberto Del Rio, so they get a bit of a rub there and then push them as a tag team. Maybe that's another thing they could do. What about Zack Ryder? Zack Ryder has a bit of career momentum. He has a following. Why not use that and have him and Hawkins back together now with the act that they can present and invest in them as a tag team? What about teams like the Dark City Fight Club, a team that could come in and be the big man team of the roster? What about bringing in teams like the Briscoes from Ring of Honor? The Briscoes have gone as far as they can in Ring of Honor. They've done everything they need to do. Now in Ring of Honor, they can only win the titles so many times without it becoming redundant. And even though they've become aggressive heels and they're these, very, very full-on violent heels now in Ring of Honor, I think fans would like to see them in something else. And hopefully a move to the WWE would be something good for them. That could really be a benefit to them as they need a fresh environment. What about possibly re-signing some other teams? Maybe bringing back Kaval and using him in a tag team role. What about bringing back Paul London and Brian Kendrick? That's wishful thinking, but what do you see happening? Do you think the WWE are going to invest in these tag teams? Do you think the WWE are just building our hopes up and are going to just squash this? Or do you think there's something that's going to come of this? Let me know what you think. And also, let me know what you think of the pairing of Miz and R-Truth, because I really want to know what fans think about that. Anyways, I've got to get going, so excuse me, pardon me. Let me know what you think, and I will be back very, very soon.